Welcome back, everybody. Last session of what's been an interesting day so far. My name is Paul Nunn. I'm head of the catastrophe risk modelling for SCOR, and I will be moderating a panel discussion. So no more slides for the day. And the panel discussion is going to look at the role that natural catastrophe models and the organisations that specialise in making them can play in helping us as an industry and as a wider society assimilate the evolving science that's out there into our decision-making frameworks. As I said, both from an insurance and reinsurance perspective, but also for wider societal benefit. For many of you will know what a CAT model is, what a catastrophe model is. For those of you that don't, I'll give you a very quick introduction. Catastrophe models combine a synthesis of an understanding of hazard along with an engineering knowledge around fragility of buildings under strain and couple them together, typically in software packages, to provide tools that the insurance and reinsurance industry can use to understand the incidents and the costs associated with extreme catastrophic events. And typically we're talking about earthquakes and hurricanes and extratropical cyclones, and less so, but more recently, natural catastrophe models have been used for flood modelling as well. So that's, in a nutshell, what CAT models do. From my perspective, I think that they've been a tremendous force for good in the industry. They've helped the industry to have a framework that they can develop and use and have a harmonized and consistent view across wide organizations for quantifying risk, and they've become endemic in creating a language of risk that helps with risk transfer and has facilitated the risk transfer process within the industry and wider out into capital markets as well. So that's the landscape that we're talking about, and I'm pleased to have with us on the panel four senior executives from the four most influential organisations in this space. From the left, we have Hemant Shah, who's CEO of RMS. Next, we have Jay Gwynn, who is an executive vice president from AIR Worldwide. And then Dickie Whitaker, CEO of Oasis. And then Lindeen Patton, who heads up, is the global head of hazard product and business development for Core Logic, who have recently bought Equicat, which was a global CAT modelling company. So my four panelists have, to paraphrase the quote from George Box, my four panelists have all had successful careers and worked for successful businesses, selling us useful models that don't work. And with that, we will start to address some of the questions. If you excuse me, I'll sit down. So the first question that we're going to talk about is, what role can catastrophe models play in informing the debate and discussion and policy making around climate change? So can we start with Hemant?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the SCOR Foundation for giving me this opportunity. I think my view is that the particular genius of the insurance industry and reinsurance as well is that it monetizes risk, and the benefits of insurance and reinsurance and alternative capital certainly ex post the catastrophe helps speed recovery, which study after study has shown increases the economic resiliency of our society. But I think more profoundly, by monetizing risk, it creates incentives ex ante to mitigate and manage risk downwards over time. It's not just about moving money from one place to another. It's about monetizing risk and therefore creating incentives in our global economy to reduce risk. And one thing that's animated me since founding RMS 25 years ago is the opportunity to try to provide modeling to insurers and reinsurers so they could quantify more risk, therefore monetize more risk, therefore create more incentives in our economy to manage and reduce risk. And I think this frontier that we're exploring here at the SCOR Foundation on climate change is to extend the modeling domain from the annual exceedance probability view of climatic hazards to a multi-year or even multi-decadal view of climate change risk, I think provides an opportunity to monetize this dimension of risk, which can encourage the insurance industry, reinsurance capital providers, and alternative capital providers to allocate more capital to cover that risk and therefore monetizing climate risk into the stream of our economy, which I think will reduce risk over time by providing the right incentives.
Again, thank you, Paul. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm based in Boston at AIR. Listening to the sessions earlier this morning and right before the break, I think that's pretty much what we live with as catastrophe modelers. So elements of what I was listening to is what we actually do. So certainly catastrophe models have a big role in terms of informing the debate and decision-making process for climate change. So I'll kind of confine my remarks to two areas. One is, do models that the kind we develop educate us or lead us to certain ways in terms of understanding the climate we are living in today, and what can we learn from it? So to build upon what Paul just described is the description of a catastrophe model. So the promise of the models that all our organizations build is that, let's take the case of floods or storms. So the model is supposed to stochastically simulate a full universe of plausible storms that could occur today or tomorrow. That's really what the underlying promise of a model is. And that's a very tall order. If you think about it, we are therefore saying that we understand the full range of climate variability, and we are simulating storms, if we stick to storms, that really encompasses the full universe. Meaning, if you have a model and you have an actual storm occurrence tomorrow that falls completely outside the space of what you have modeled, then clearly you got it wrong. Either the model is wrong, or then you start thinking about, is there an underlying shift in the climate because of which I have now made a completely extraneous observation. So there is certainly a lot that climate catastrophe models can inform in terms of our understanding of that variability. Then the other part I would say is we think about climate change and immediately our minds go towards time scale. Are we talking about 5 years from now, 50 years from now, or 200 years from now? So the models over time have gotten pretty good in terms of modeling the severity, meaning the consequence part of it. Given an event, the models, I think, have improved over time that they can pretty well estimate what are the consequences. So that is very powerful, because if you think about, for policymakers, we talk a lot about climate change, but it's very difficult to take action. And one of the reasons is because there is uncertainty associated with everything that we estimate. However, if we can translate those estimates of future climate scenarios into financial dollars, then I think it's easier to move policymakers and decision makers. And that's where, again, catastrophe models can play a role. Just to make that a little more tangible, so let's say in the future tropical cyclones, we heard that the general consensus is the frequency is probably going to stay the same or decrease, and the severity is going to go up. So you can immediately use today's catastrophe models to stress test those future scenarios and say, these are the financial consequences if there is no adaptation. And that is extremely powerful. And at AIR, we have done some of that work. Actually, with RMS, we did a work for the ABI, the Association of British Insurers, to look at some of these future climate scenarios.
Well, I don't disagree with any of my two colleagues on the platform here, but let me just try and perhaps take a slightly different angle on this. So, well, first of all, I think that the role that catastrophe models play has been underestimated by society as a series of tools, and in fact as a modeling paradigm that you can use to try and understand the effect of current weather and current climate. And I think it's really hard to try and make an assessment of future climate if one doesn't understand not only the current climate, but the uncertainties around it. So if for the moment one just takes that premise and accepts that premise, then we're left with a couple of challenges. So one of them is that we have an enormous body of expertise and scientists around the world who are trying to opine around the subject about what climate change is actually going to try and do. Yet the translation of that into something that can be used by cities and corporations, possibly even individuals, is extremely limited because of the significant barriers that sit between practical tools that can allow for decision making. And we've already heard from some of the previous speakers about some of the challenges that might involve. What I think catastrophe modeling does extremely well is turn that challenge into something that has practical use at potentially very low costs. So I think it's absolutely fundamental that we try and get other people to understand how you can use these tools to make informed decisions about things like, should I build a dam to prevent certain types of flooding to certain catchments or certain cities or certain towns? And what is the cost-benefit analysis of doing so? And to do that, you can look at current state. You can then theoretically take scientists around the world and say, well, their view is the frequencies are going to change, because as Jay sort of said, we have some understanding about how the severity is going to work. The trouble is, I would say that at the moment, the bulk of these global scientists don't understand how to do that, and they don't actually necessarily have vehicles that allow them to do that very easily. And the goal that when we set up OASIS was really about opening up the world of CAT modeling to the global scientific community and to the end users that sit both inside the insurance and reinsurance industry and at the world at large. And I think if we actually manage to achieve that between those of us on this platform and others, then we will be some way towards helping achieve the benefit we should have. And I should mention that one other thing is critical in this, and again, it's been mentioned before, is the treatment of uncertainty. If we don't have some transparency in how we use these tools, and if we don't understand how to represent uncertainty, we're going to be really challenged in getting some robust answers to these complex questions.
Lindeen, you have some views on the roles of CAT models?
Yes, I do. Thank you again for inviting me. Very much appreciate it. It's very nice to see people who I know in the audience, and I'm very happy to be here. I think the perspective that CoreLogic comes from is slightly different than a traditional modeling perspective. We are a data and analytics company, not purely a modeling company. Acquisition of a modeling company was done to enable decision-taking and allow additional analytics to our customer base so that they might be able to address current weather as well as climate change. Before I came to CoreLogic, I worked in the climate change area and actually became frustrated because a lot of the analytics that I wanted to do to help communicate to broader society as well as the insurance community the potential impacts and particularly the vulnerabilities and financial impacts associated with climate change were not possible, or I was told they were not possible because we lacked data. And so part of why I am at CoreLogic is because it is a data and analytics company. And so I went to a different side of the financial services industry to try to find out what type of data was available and why it was so difficult to take this incredibly valuable sophisticated modeling system which looks at science and looks at exposure bases and comes with outputs that for some reason broader society was unable or unwilling to consume. It just isn't comfortable. They can't get their hands around it. So what I found was that in the other side, in the mortgage and finance and other types of securities environment, there are data stores. And in fact, they generally come in about 9 buckets. You can get a ton of information about individual properties, crime, property tax, flood data, geopolitical data, credit data, delinquency in payment, equity investment levels. You can get information about mortgage-backed securities, multiple listing services, or places which facilitate the sale of property. You can aggregate information about replacement costs for existing built structures, and you can get information about multifamily housing and commercial property, all linked to a specific lat long. Let me repeat that, all linked to a specific lat long and cross-linked to address. And if you can take that data store and basically leverage that through an existing set of models, you have made property more like auto, which a lot of us have been talking about, but we're on the cusp of that reality. But more importantly, I think what that does, it allows us to address what has been a really nagging problem in the climate area, which is a demand problem. And that demand problem, again, exists because consumer stakeholders in this space just can't get comfortable with the impacts of climate change. So what we're trying to look at is identifying markets who need vulnerability data and analytics to assist in the decision-taking, trying to determine the sophistication of these multiple users. So basically taking these incredible assets that have been built and framed on the one hand by the insurance industry, on the other hand by the mortgage and mortgage-backed securities industry, along with cities and counties and other governments, and merging that data, mashing it up, and trying to come up with outputs, which is kind of like going to the grocery store and knowing you have a big bag of groceries. But you've got to figure out what your customers want. And you're going to have some customers, which are high-end commercial restaurants. They want particular feedstocks. They're going to make their own recipe. Okay? You're going to have people who want to cook at home, and they want more information themselves. But their ability to do sophisticated things is different, and they may want it packaged differently. And then you're going to have the carry-out crew, the people who just want to be able to go and pick up their food to go, and whatever it is, it's good enough for them. And I realize it's kind of an odd analogy, but I really think that if we want to give people a feeling for what is the risk to me as a member of a community with respect to the impacts of climate change and/or weather today, you have to be able to give them a way to relate to that information. And the best way to do that is to get them to understand what is happening at the point on the earth that they're standing in. And so I think that's what we're looking towards, is to trying to develop vehicles. And this is where I think modeling has an incredible value to go forward and communicate and change the demand curve for information about climate change. In the United States, the other reason I was so interested in the mortgage industry is that it used to be 2 decades ago, if you went to buy a home, you never asked whether there was asbestos in that home. You didn't know if there was lead. You didn't know if there was radon in the basement. Today, under most legal schemes, there are mandatory disclosures for those hazards. And why did that happen? It happened because the consumers became aware that that data was available and it was reliable. And they said, if that data is there, I want it. It's the most important asset I have. It's core to my community. It's core to my personal life. I want it. And so I think what we have to do is enable that capacity.
Thank you, Lindeen. I think from SCOR's perspective, we would consider ourselves to be a high-end restaurant.
That's correct.
But yeah, I think I would certainly agree that that the customer base needs to get much wider, because I think that the industry, the insurance and reinsurance industry, can't fund the level of investment and research and development on its own. And you know, we have so many uncertainties in different directions that we need to find a broader base in terms of customers that are able to support and finance the research and development, which kind of takes me on to the second kind of theme, which relates to the flexibility within catastrophe models. Historically, catastrophe model suppliers have competed on who has the best reference model for a particular region peril. Given all of the uncertainties, and we've seen some of the IPCC scenarios and charts of different futures that might happen, could and also should catastrophe models offer a much wider variety of options for organizations to sensitivity test and look at the what ifs, because we don't yet know, and the science of attribution is developing, but it certainly isn't clear what the future will be. So on that point around flexibility and more options, Dickie, do you want to start on answering that one?
Sure. Well, I suppose fundamentally, when we set up Oasis, one of the things we try to do was to offer flexibility. So it's hard for me not to see that as being clearly a goal we want to look at. But of course, what matters is what we really mean by flexibility. Infinite flexibility sort of doesn't make any sense either. So I think what we're talking about is actually trying to get a set of standards that allow for flexibility within the parameters and the approach that actually makes sense. And I think flexibility means that we have to have approaches and systems that can be used by a range of academics to help inform us. Gets back to this communication with the academic world on this one area. And I'm sort of staggered by how little literature you can get in the public domain that talks about this paradigm of cat modeling. There are hardly any academic institutions around the world that actually really understand it. When I go and talk to universities, they sort of may know about it, but they don't really understand what it's talking about. You can't find any peer-reviewed documentation really about it. And that's just going to restrict our ability to use these tools effectively. So I think that we have to have, I think flexibility is clearly important, particularly to make sure that when we have a particular academic that says, my belief is that this element of climate change is important and this is how it's represented, that the tools that we produce can represent that view without having to distort what they're doing. And that actually is an incredibly difficult thing to do. So I think that's particularly where I see the flexibility. And I think it's important that we have some more approach to openness. And I know that, I think pretty much Hemant, you talked about this in Zurich a couple of years ago. I know we sort of share that, but it's actually quite difficult when the industry, and I'm talking about particularly obviously the insurance industry here, can be very critical of some of these approaches where, in many cases, the industry's understanding of uncertainty isn't as good as it should be. So I think it's very, very challenging to actually make that work in practice, but we're all going to have to work together to make it, otherwise we won't get useful tools and we won't get sort of progress in this important area.
I think I'll just echo what Dickie just said about his first comments about flexibility is important, and I think all of you need to understand what's behind the models, what are the critical assumptions, and stress test those critical assumptions. But at the same time, it has to be done with a certain degree of responsibility. Why do I say that? Because the fact is those of us who have been in the weeds with developing these models, they are extremely sensitive. And it's not, they are sensitive because for the wrong reasons. That's the nature of risk. It is very sensitive. So if the wind is blowing at 45 meters per second versus 55 meters per second, it means a very big difference. So given the sensitive nature of it, I think we have to develop the models so that there is less chance of misuse of the models. So that's one comment I just wanted to make. And clearly at AIR, we are trying to make our software applications and the models themselves so that various parameters with the models can be changed. And we are trying to empower the user, because one thing that has happened in the insurance industry through regulatory regimes, there is a push for all of you to have to own your risk. Owning the risk means that you've got to understand what's in the model. The other dimension, I'll go back to my talk about the time frames. So when we talk about catastrophe models today, so if I want to understand hurricane risk today, when I use the word today, I mean over the next few years, there is climate variability, and that whole range of variability can be partially explained by various climate signals. So if the El Nino is about guaranteed to be setting in this year, what does it mean for the hurricane season in the Atlantic now that we are already officially in that season? So one of the goals we have, and we are doing research, is can we develop the model so that conditional views of the risk with different phases of ENSO signal or different phases of the AMO or the PDO or the joint conditions can be easily determined. So that's another powerful tool in all the array of tools for risk management, where you can develop shorter term views, if you will. But again, the reality is it is not easy. If it was easy, people would have done it by now. The correlations are more than complex, and they're not that simple, where you see a signal and you can oftentimes get fooled by, okay, I got a signal, but that may not be the right signal. The last point I would make about flexibility is, as I was saying, we can use the catastrophe models to develop views of risk 50 years or 100 years out. Where we have struggled as a company is the utility of those views of risk to you as the insurance industry. We certainly see there's utility in the on the government side for certain policy and decision makers, but for the insurance industry, I'll just quote a chief risk officer of a medium-sized reinsurance company who recently we were having this discussion about what they would like us to see doing for climate change, and his quick remark was, well, the reinsurance industry has dealt with climate change by writing one-year contracts. So that was his answer. So don't worry about climate change. You don't have to do anything. So that was his response. So that's a struggle we have as to how can we help the industry, and because decision-making is harder when you think about very long time scales.
Paul, thanks for the prompt on uncertainty and modeling assumptions. There's, I think, about $300 billion of reinsurance capital currently in the space, and about $60 billion of pension or pension-related capital has come in, and that's just a drop in the bucket against $1 trillion that's out there. A 1% asset allocation would bring a total of $600 billion in capital. This is real money, and it's important that capital providers understand their implied bets, take control of their view of risk, and make the models their own. And I think all the modeling firms are working very hard to expose implied assumptions as express, and increasingly provide the analytic frameworks to explore uncertainty. With respects to climate risk, the principal drivers of uncertainty are less the specific parameterization of the models as they exist today. It's more the uncertainty in the future state of our climate and what that means for one's view of risk on a decadal or multi-decadal cycle. We did a very interesting project last year sponsored by an organization called Risky Business, which was sponsored by a group of business leaders in the United States and political leaders from both parties, with Michael Bloomberg as the lead, to try to provide a comprehensive quantification of climate change risk, to provide an analytic framework for a call to action by the business community. And to give you a flavor of the uncertainty, we incorporated a range of modeling assumptions from the climate models, CMIP 3, 4.5, 8.5, a whole range of sea level modeling assumptions, and generated essentially hundreds of versions of our reference view of risk. And the modeling suggested that under a range of plausible assumptions, the average increase in the expected annual loss multi-decades out is about a minimum of 50%, but could be as much as 200% in the United States alone. And even more variability if you look at the tails of those distributions. And so it suggests the amount of uncertainty in the system, but I think it's also important not to get paralyzed by the uncertainties, because it can also obscure the call to action. When we certainly do see, and the modeling seems to provide a reasonable basis for risk is increasing. Even a 50% increase, which is the absolute minimum of any plausible range of assumptions, is quite material against a baseline of $25 billion in annualized loss per year on coastal exposure in the United States. And it also suggests that going forward, climate change is going to drive a pretty important secular shift in coastal risk from wind-driven risk to water-driven risk. Right now, again, in the US alone, about 30% of the expected annual losses from coastal risk are driven by by surge. That's going to cross over 50% by the middle of the century, and the order will switch in the later decades. So there's a lot of useful and actionable insight that models can provide if you take a pragmatic view on trying to incorporate the uncertainty and provide policy-relevant modeling frameworks to galvanize action by understanding what the monetization of that risk is, so that mitigation and solutions can be put in place.
Great. So as you can see, if you come on the hazard side of the business, we need a lot of help from economists. It's very clear. But I think to get to the point of your question, should the models be more flexible to deal with scenario building? My answer is absolutely yes, they have to be, to maintain relevance in society. They can't be narrow and inaccessible and still maintain relevance. But here again, I think the issue is not necessarily particularly the models. The issue is the data and the way that those analytics are packaged and delivered to particular shareholders and users. And so if you have a business which was built to serve insurers and reinsurers, it's going to have a particular set of output characteristics which are just not consumable by people not in this business in most cases. So to make that accessible, certain things that are now truly legacy in this business need to be addressed. And I think the challenge, which has already been articulated to some degree here, is that there is a temporal dissonance between the problem that society is trying to address in the context of climate change, which is multi-decadal, and the average term of the instrument in the context of insurance. This is another place where I have been trying to learn from my colleagues in the other side of financial services, where they have dealt with trying to promote things like policy of home ownership, using instruments which are actually not temporally consistent with the ultimate asset purchase and use. And so in that context, I would suggest that there are tools that have been used by making information available about economics and about human behavior and about underlying asset characteristics that have substantially enabled the mortgage and finance and other parts of the financial services industry to solve economic problems, to solve social problems, using instruments which are not necessarily temporally consistent with the ultimate value of those assets. And so there is opportunity here overall. I just think we have to step back and look at the opportunities in a slightly different way. But again, it's going to have to be driven by data, because a model alone, as one of our customers told us quite clearly, isn't going to fix it. It's going to be what you put through that model and what you know about that model that helps you interpret the output.
Thank you, Lindeen. I think that it's an interesting point you make about taking the opportunity to learning from other disciplines, and I think that leads nicely into the last question, because we've assembled within the room and within the program over the next 2 days a real mixed bag of different disciplines, from mathematicians, statisticians, economists, modelers, insurance, reinsurance professionals. And I think that we all have a lot that we can learn from each other, whether that's formally in terms of looking at listening to the presentations and listening and looking at slides and reading people's papers, but also informally in the discussions. So can I ask you to give a view on where you see the biggest challenges that your specific organisations face in trying to assimilate climate science into what you're doing as organisations? Jay, do you want to start?
Sure. So first of all, we are nearing 30 years of catastrophe modeling industry. AIR was formed in 1987, so we are getting there. So in these 30 years, we today virtually model all tropical cyclone basins, most of the important ETC basins. So we have done a body of work. But again, that science has evolved as we have developed these models. And today we find ourselves at a point where we really can leverage computing power, for one, better statistical modeling techniques. We just heard about some flavors of that in the session just before the break. The power of computers to really leverage large-scale physical modeling simulations, whether it's a GCM or a NWP nested within a GCM. This has kind of opened up completely new possibilities of where we take modeling today. And but one of the challenges we face in trying to do so is still the fact that we only have good knowledge of 30 to 40 years of history. You have anecdotal information of prehistoric events. So I think the problem was very succinctly stated that at the end of the day, no matter what we are doing, we are engaged in a process of extrapolation. Let's be very clear. So we can throw a lot of buzzwords at it, but at the end of the day, it's still extrapolation. So when you are trying to extrapolate from a finite set of data, you can throw all the hardware at it. Your model is only as good as the knowledge that you have and how good that data is. So data quality is a challenge for us. Secondly, I think the number of observations are limited, and they are especially limited in developing countries. So we recently built a flood hazard maps for all of China. So for the whole country of China, if you have tried to get any data in China, you know what I mean. It's like pulling teeth. It's very difficult to get any data in China. Contrast that to the United States. You can go to the USGS website. You can download the last 30, 70 years of flow station data freely available, and you can do wonderful things with it. So that's another dimension of data availability and the quality of data, especially in developing areas. Third, and I think Lindeen has made this point a couple of times, what is being put into the model is also equally important. So we have now built a US-wide inland flood model, which was used for analyzing all of NFIP's portfolio last year. So now we can, through our model, say, okay, this is what a 1,000-year flood for the United States looks like. Without a model, you can only guess. But now the question is, the industry also has to step up and put the right level of exposure data to harness the power of the model. So that's another element I think we face as a challenge, that exposure data quality doesn't necessarily keep up with the quality at which the models are kind of moving forward.
That's fine. So the biggest challenge, I think, I would articulate is maintaining and creating market relevance so that we can enable greater demand. And why do I think this is important, and why is it such a significant challenge? I think that the insurance industry has used natural catastrophe modeling both to retain and manage risk, but also to shed risk. And when that risk was shed, it was shed to much less aware or from a risk management perspective, less sophisticated entities. And that has resulted in a circumstance where the risk didn't go away. It simply went to different people. And those people don't have the ability, I'm talking about cities, counties, federal governments, to manage the data and risk and interpret it in the same way that the insurance industry does. So that flexibility in changing those is essential. But consistent with what Nicholas noted in his discussion about risk aversion and that sort of funny behavior, human behavior that wants the bigger catastrophe. We see this now all the time, multiple times a year, at least in the United States, where everyone says, well, someone else must be handling this risk, right? And what you find is more and more disaster aid throughput and less engagement on the part of the parties to whom the risk was shed to want to learn more about that risk. And I think that there are other factors which I think have to do with equity levels and policy structures, which are important, but we will hit a limit where that approach will mean that there at one point won't be enough money to solve the problem if the risk management behavior isn't improved in many ways. So I think the challenge is making the outputs from this very sophisticated industry accessible to more than just insurers and reinsurers. But moreover, it's not free. So we have to figure out how to get people to acknowledge that it would be okay if they paid for this type of analytic, if you did it in a mass enough scale, just like they pay to understand whether they have radon in their basements, whether they have lead paint on their property before they invest. There are things which I think we need to get more facile with, and it's sort of the antithesis of some of the sophistication level, but we have to realize that to get engagement and to get to the next step in terms of risk management, we're going to have to use the tools we have outside of the industry as well as inside of the industry. But that's a complex, long-term goal. But I think we are to the point where there's enough data, and again, learning from the mortgage side of the house and financial services, and from the shared services model, which I think people on this side of the industry might not be so familiar with. Generally, banks use a lot of common service providers, not only to collect data, to populate underwriting files, to service, and perform a wide variety of other functions that are not in-house. Those shared services have resulted in industry-available databases that are held by my company and others that could enable amazingly improvement of the exposure assessment and the vulnerability evaluation. So I think that's the challenge, and you just have to have a methodical way to get there.
Thank you. Dickie, with as Chief Executive of Oasis, which is sort of a startup organisation, you must have plenty of challenges. Would you like to set out a few of them?
No, frankly. I don't need therapy quite yet, and it might end up that way. But to come at it from a more sort of a broader issue, I mean, I think this is a very complex question, and Lindine's given sort of one way of looking at it. I would say that the challenge is that there's a huge chasm between the global academic community and the end users. And by end users, I mean all of them, not just the insurance industry, as Lindine's already talked about. And that's created by a number of things. It's created by incentives, it's created by knowledge, it's created by standards and interoperability, or lack of standards and lack of interoperability. I talked a little bit about the knowledge, so I won't deal with that one again. But I think on incentives, I don't see that there is much of a drive for the climate scientists to try and make too much end-user relevance for what they're doing. They certainly, in some cases, don't have the knowledge of how to do that, and the tools and standards and interoperability that would make that easy are hard to achieve. So I think how I would see that sort of working is that I think to a degree, Oasis, which was started as a not-for-profit organisation, decided that it was going to publish standards. And those standards are open to criticism and viewpoint from the people on this panel and others as whether they're right or wrong. We haven't seen enough openness, and we haven't seen peer review of those sort of techniques, and I think that's extremely important to have that happen. Secondly, we gave away the software. And whilst I would agree with Lindine that you've got to pay for something, actually the question is, what are you going to pay for? And are we already not paying for scientists publicly funded around the world who are doing work in this area? It's just that we can't always release the intelligence that they have from that information without being translated through a very small number of tools represented largely by the people on this platform. We'd like to see something that opens that up so many more people can opine and provide a viewpoint, which I should stress, I hope that my colleagues here sort of have their shareholders remain happy and profitable for some time, but that doesn't mean they need to be the only players in this space. So I think ultimately, sort of from a sort of high-level perspective, I think there's a massive opportunity for the insurance industry to take some leadership here. And I take today and tomorrow as being a fairly significant step in that process to us taking some leadership as the insurance industry in actually collaborating with the global scientific community, with organizations like the WMO. I know there's people from the Geneva Association here. If we all collaborate together, we've got a reasonable chance of actually solving some problems that are extremely difficult to solve. If we remain in our silos, then I think we're going to not be having the type of conversations we should be having.
Dickie, I completely agree. We need to find a way to make it possible for 1,000 flowers to bloom against this problem. Paul, the multidisciplinary context of your prompt, four corners of the room, the scientific community, the modeling practitioners, the public policy dimension, and the commercial sector, in this context, financial services and insurance and reinsurance, do all need to find a common vernacular and frameworks to solve this problem together. One of the most satisfying projects I had the opportunity to work on in my career was related to a different kind of public policy challenge around terrorism risk, where the question on the table was what's the right public policy architecture in the United States that led to the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. And it was a similar kind of multidisciplinary collaboration between the scientists, which are the underlying threat assessment thought leaders, the modeling practitioners, the decision scientists, public policy, and insurance and reinsurance. And a big part of what I learned through that process was how important it is to have a really robust decision science framework to framing what kind of questions need to be asked and how the modeling needs to be formulated to provide policy relevant insight against those questions. And there's a tremendous body of research and modeling in the decision sciences community, particularly around robust decision making under deep uncertainty, to bring those kinds of tools to bear against this problem. On back to climate, one of the climate initiatives we're working on is with the initiative called Rebound, which is sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation and also involves some other financial services companies along with RMS. And it goes back to trying to bring more financial services innovation to bear as well. It's not just about science innovation. It's about trying to break out of the straitjacket, has been alluded, of the one-year contract. And I love this concept of the temporal dissonance between a risk that plays out over years, if not decades, and financial services products that are annual in nature. And in this Rebound initiative, we're working to develop some strategies that might lead to catastrophe bond-like vehicles to provide infrastructure financing mechanisms to prompt the development of resilient infrastructure such as seawalls or a stormwater infrastructure that play out, the benefits play out over years and decades. The costs are significant, but there might be a way of monetizing the cost of risk and the benefits of risk mitigation into a multi-year kind of bond structure with innovative capital deployed to try to create real practical solutions. And these kinds of things are only possible if you bring together multidisciplinary forums like you're hosting here through the SCOR Foundation, because no one corner of that room has even 25% of the answers.
Thank you very much. I would like to throw open to some questions from the floor. I think we have a little bit of time. Can we just wait for the microphones to distribute around the room? Okay, the lady here is the first one. And if the microphone can be on its way to the gentleman in the blue shirt over there.
Thank you very much. Innovation from this industry has led to a number of ideas in the development and the science world. So I had the opportunity of working at WMO as well as in the development community. But reality right now is many of you, I guess maybe exception to reference to China, are talking about the developed countries' experience and the data that you were talking about. I had the opportunity of working down, to the country level in 40 countries developing, and including China. And I can, by the way, beg that there is a lot more data that you can even imagine that's very organized in China, but you just have to know where to get it. The issue becomes, I think what we faced was the issue of public-private partnerships and building a trust between this sector, the finance sector, and the governments in terms of financing of this kind of risk. Many entities like the World Bank, working with many of you, have gone down to the government level to try to map the risk. But let me tell you a reality. Governments will not trust models that are done in black box and offered to them in terms of what the risk profile is. They want to own that. They want to run it, but look at the distribution of your expertise. I mean, just in each of your companies, the extent of expertise that sits there. And in reality, Dickie, it's not the global scientific community that's going to do the work. It's going to be who has the role to do the analysis of the risk, and it comes down to federal, provincial and local governments and their ability to bring the experts in. So here is my question. My question is, with the level of sophistication of the models today, forget about integrating climate models into it, okay? Just level of sophistication of risk models today. How can we penetrate this kind of expertise? Let's go back to even some developed countries. I was doing the flood risk modeling in Canada. Okay, it's a hot topic. Mm-hmm. Even in Canada, the provincial governments that have responsibility for flood risk modeling don't have that expertise. So can you provide suggestions as to how we can bring the level of expertise that's required to run these sophisticated models down to the level where governments actually trust to bring their data in and start trusting the analysis that's going to feed into their policy, as opposed to be told so with a black box? I'm being very upfront, but I really have seen that for the last 10 years of my career. And until we don't have these open discussions between private sector and the public sector, I don't think we can break those barriers. Thank you.
I think that's, I think you raise a very real issue. I guess the only way forward is to experiment with different models. There's one interesting experiment that I'm somewhat familiar with called the Resilient Cities Initiative, which is something that I find very innovative. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a different strategy, as you say, to try to engage this issue throughout the world in a more grassroots way, not through the large multilateral agencies or the big global modeling firms, but in this case of the Resilient Cities Initiative, which we're making a modest contribution to, it's about engaging stakeholders at the city level and try to create a global community of like-minded city and civic leaders. And they've identified 100 cities around the world with fair representation from both the developed and the developing world, and to try to create a common framework for thinking about risk, the promulgation of a chief resiliency officer at the city level, the use of modeling and analytics to provide a kind of more grassroots basis for assessing risk, not at just the country level, but at the city level where things really matter and where there's civic leadership that might be able to actually initiate some change actions as opposed to just talking about this stuff at conferences. So I just offer that as one of I imagine many experiments that I think need to be run to try to get engagement at the right level that drives change, as opposed to just people talking to each other about how smart they are, which is what we tend to do.
in the spirit of trying to get some more questions, can we have couple of quick points, and then we'll move on.
Go ahead, and then
I'll just say, Miriam, that there are many examples of public-private examples on the climate side. I think we have done work through the World Bank, Asia Development Bank, for, say, the pool of risks from all the South Pacific Island nations. I think you're familiar with that, and I think that has worked out very well. There is a similar transaction that took place for the Caribbean islands, for the government of Mexico. Right now, there's deep discussion going on for countries in Southeast Asia. So there are examples of that, and I wouldn't necessarily say that they have come across as they're using black box tools. I think there is a fair degree of transparency in how those analyses are done. Another example, not on climate, would be the Global Earthquake Model Initiative. That is a true public-private initiative. AR is a founding member of that, and I think some of the models that are just beginning to emerge from that initiative will very likely be used for some of these applications you're talking about.
Just to quickly add, I think that, I mean, I wasn't talking only about the insurance industry, by the way. We're doing some work in Bangladesh at the moment. I think what we're doing has to apply to everybody. Other than the things I've already said, we are at the moment trying to set up a group of massive online training courses that is a way of trying to deal with that issue. Because you're absolutely right, it is ridiculous that the level of expertise required to do these things is resident within such a small number of people, and we've got to find a way of changing that.
So I would try to make really 4 core points. We are a commercial business. We do have to be compensated for IP. That said, there is value from the data. There is experimentation going on in this area. I think that we have to get it right in the developed markets to be a model for the emerging markets. So I'm not quite sure we're there yet on all of these issues. And we have the confounder, in my opinion, in the context of the emerging markets, is you have a great challenge associated with labor cost disparity, where the knowledge is in a high-cost labor zone and the need is in a low-cost labor zone, which means that you end up with, by design, a lot of subsidy, which is fundamentally not commercial, and really not much thought given to the transition ramp out to becoming commercial and sustainable. So that means that you may not get, for example, the level of engagement or the same kind of engagement commercially that perhaps policymakers desire in those markets under circumstances where there are existing markets that are otherwise driving us. So I think a balance and recognizing that it is possible. We do these partnerships now with private companies. We do that with social media companies. We do them with financial services companies. Those are things that there's value to those collaborations that yield more than 1 + 1 is 2.
Thank you for the question, gentlemen.
Thanks. Charlie Kolstad, Stanford University. I just wanted to make sense of 2 statements I heard. Jay, I think, said that the insurance industry has responded to climate change by saying, well, we'll just write 1-year policies, then we don't have to worry about changes in the climate. And Hemant said that in the risky business area, they found that there are very substantial decadal changes in exposure. And I just wondered if those are conflicting statements or really they're totally consistent with one another.
There's no conflict in those statements. Both are true. Again, first of all, I was commenting on the reflection of probably a narrow segment of the insurance industry. Not everybody feels alike. That's point number 1. But the reality is the majority of insurance contracts are on an annual basis globally. That's a fact. Having said that, there is probably a very narrow sliver of instruments that are written on a multi-year basis, but those are still of the order of 3 to 5 year, a catastrophe bond for 3 to 5 year time horizon. And that hardly feels like a 30-year instrument. So that's one, and I think the comment that Hemant was making is also indeed true, because the models do give us those insights, and I'm sure you want to add.
I'll just say go Cardinal. Go Cardinal. I'm a Stanford. We spun this company out of Stanford. No, I think Jay said it well. The risk is increasing over time. The contracts are 1 year. It creates a situation where many don't feel the need to take a view on what the multi-year risk is, but increasingly I see industry leaders leaning in and developing strategies for multi-year financial contracts that are aligned with the temporal duration of the risk, particularly around infrastructure and large value assets. And I think we'll see a lot of innovation from the reinsurance and capital market sector in that space in the coming years.
Yeah, and I would just offer that I actually think the statements are consistent. The problem is the result for the consumer and for society at large is that you get a one-year price signal, right? You're getting a price signal for what the climate is today and that component of climate change which is manifest. The challenge that you have is that if you send a price signal for what you have today and you know that it's climbing and there's no warning bell, there's no flag out there saying, hey, this is on this trajectory with anyone that believes it or who is folding that into policy and otherwise into the economic structure in a longer term, you end up with residual markets and other things.
Paul, sorry, I wasn't going to say anything. I just decided to change my mind. I really think it's important because I've had a number of people say to me, why isn't the insurance industry doing more on climate change? And actually, it sort of irritates me because organizations like SCOR, like Munich Re here, like Swiss Re, like Lloyd's, I mean, here's a publication from Lloyd's on climate change and using CAT models. There's an awful lot around the world that's been done in this space. The trouble is that it's hard, right? It's very, very hard. And the sort of, I think you described as a rather glib statement from somebody, which I think is how it should be taken, isn't representative of how the industry's been looking at the whole. So actually the answer is we're trying to do our best. The funding for Oasis is an attempt to do that. So I don't want you or anybody else to get the impression that we're not doing something in this space, because I think we are.
Thank you. I think we've got an opportunity to run over a little bit, so I'll take two more questions. The gentleman at the back there.
It's more of a clarification to Jay. You mentioned that the data which has been available has only been available for the last few decades. Quoting from the IPCC report, which I got in front of me actually, it says the global average combined land and ocean surface temperature data has calculated by a linear trend showing a warming of 0.85 centigrade over a period of 1880 to 2012, when multiple independent produced data sets exist. Can you clarify?
Okay, I fully agree. What I was referring to is the kind of data sets that are needed to build catastrophe models, which are usually the time series or the historical record of the actual catastrophe. So if you are trying to understand tropical cyclone risk in the Northwest Pacific Basin, so you would probably go to JMA or some other equivalent best track data set, and that's usually for 40 to 50 years. But more so, even within that 40 to 50 years, the first 2 decades are questionable. If you study the data, you start seeing a lot of artifacts in the data, which is really not data. Somebody had to populate it. So we have heard the reference to reanalysis data sets today a couple of times. Those, in theory, are the promise of the evolution of the Earth's atmosphere over the last 30 to 40 years. The reason I emphasize in theory, there are at least a handful of such reanalysis products, and if you are deep into the science, you'll see there are tremendous differences across those reanalysis data sets.
So
and
are you questioning the data which they've actually published in the IPCC report?
No, I'm not questioning that at all.
So, but you just said you're putting doubt on this data which they've actually stated here.
No, I think maybe there is a little misunderstanding. I'm not discussing the temperature record. I'm discussing time series of actual historical events.
Well, but I think the other point that should be made is this discussion focuses only on one component of the models, and not necessarily the component that drives human behavior. So this discussion right here focused on hazard issue. And I think the point many of us are trying to make is that's one part of it. But the part that gets people connected and stakeholders to take action is they want to know how much it's going to cost. And that is the vulnerability data. And that data is also really important in time series, but it is not got this.
I think it's not
record.
how much it's going to cost, it's if it's going to affect them. If it's affecting someone else, they don't care.
Well, if they, I would respectfully suggest that in most cases, by the time it involves money, it's global.
I don't think there's any contradiction here. I think what you are saying is correct. All I'm talking about is in any time series, and I think you are also quite familiar with that, there is fact that there's technology changes over time that have taken place in how the data is recorded. So the post-satellite era versus the pre-satellite era, there are very stark differences. So as modelers, we have to be cognizant of the fact and treat the data carefully. That's the point I was making.
Thank you. One last question.
Sorry to be last if I am, but I was actually disappointed by the talk right now in the sense that I felt I was at an RMS or an AIR or an EQCAT conference. Sorry, Dicky, I've never been to an AOSIS conference. But being short, I don't want to go to why I'm disappointed, but I feel that how can you, as the CAT modeler company, and we know you have the know-how, we know you have the geophysicists and the engineers to build good models, but at the moment it feels you're still bickering about who's doing it the best. And I know you talked about the private public, but how today was a conference about climate change and how reinsurance can react to it. Should we talk to you and can you work together, or should we look towards academia or anything else that can actually give us the results where you guys are able to actually work together?
I'm going to have to get you to one of our conferences. But anyway, I've been to all of these guys' conferences too. I'm sorry that you're disappointed, first of all. I mean, it's quite difficult in a short period of time sometimes to convey something that's as broad as this. But I think maybe the lens you're looking through this is maybe not the one that certainly I am anyway. Because I think actually, these guys were talking about collaboration. We were talking about collaboration. And I think that this isn't necessarily a case, well, it's difficult, right? So at one end, as Lindeen and the others would say this too, they have shareholders they have to deal with, right? They have to share, and then they have to provide some sort of revenue. Our shareholders don't want revenue. They want something different, right? So I'm the odd one out here for a number of reasons. But I think there is talk about collaboration. We are working, Oasis is working with all of these companies to try and find ways within the parameters they have to deal with their shareholders to try and open up their data, and they all are doing something in this space. And I would say we're making progress, but sure, it's not fast enough and it's not quick enough, nothing ever is. And I'm very happy to share a glass of wine with you afterwards and try and make you feel better.
Any other comment on that? Should we leave it? We'll leave it on the promise of drink. I think with that, that concludes the proceedings for the day. I'd like to thank and ask you to help thank me for the panelists and for their time. Thank you very much.